And today we've got a special occasion because we usually geek out about go-to-market and marketing and B2B technology marketing and selling services. But today we've got a special guest, Dr. Jim Kanichirayil. The reason I wanted to bring Dr. Jim on this show today is because it's super interesting how him and I first met. I have no idea where we met. It was definitely on LinkedIn or through some webinar. And we sort of started following each other more intensively when we both joined TikTok at around the same time and started experimenting with TikTok. And initially, from the content he was producing and from the way he was putting himself out there on TikTok, I had the impression that Jim is a black belt B2B marketer because he was doing the marketing things so right and so well. And so I had the impression that Dr. Jim is a marketer, and it is later that I heard him speak at an event, and I heard that he was actually a sales guy in a sales position, and his background is more close to sales than to marketing. And well, that just got me thinking, because at that same time, I had spoken to somebody else who was in sales, and they wanted to get their organization moving in the direction of account-based marketing. And Jim was a black belt account-based marketer as a salesperson. And because I was big on this convergence between sales and marketing roles, the personality and everything that Dr. Jim was doing was beginning to be super interesting for me. It's a long-time plan of mine that came true today, and I welcome you, Dr. Jim, on stage right now. It's great to have you here, and I'm glad that you got your laptop sorted out.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. Thanks for having me on, Dan. Leave it to me to make a dramatic entrance. Actually, if you pin down how you and I met, we actually met at a virtual conference that was 3 days run by Vlad and Andre. So that's how we first started engaging. And that was a marketing conference that we attended virtually.
True. And how interesting that just recently, when we got together and chatted live for the first time, we both had the impression that we had known each other and that we had spoken previously, which is not the case. So we have never spoken face to face in real life or virtually up to a few days ago. I just told you, oh my gosh, Jim, I never really introduced myself. Like, how did you do this? You meet somebody live synchronously for the first time ever, not on chat, but on camera. So you ought to introduce yourself. But like, it was all so natural to me. And I had the impression that we had known each other for such a long time, which is true in a way. But this leads us right into the topic of today.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about that initial interaction, and it ties into a lot of things that Gary Vaynerchuk often talks about, is that if you're a seller or marketer or anybody that's in that revenue side of an organization, there's a couple of high level priorities that you have to execute on. One is answering the question, how do I build conversations at scale? And then the other question is, how do I get people to know, like, and trust me without ever really having a conversation with them? And it points to that reaction that both of us had when we first hopped on the call. It felt like we knew each other for years and that we've, kind of hung out and had beers and all that sort of stuff. And we're on different sides of the world, and you have that sort of relationship. And that's one of the critical things that sellers and marketers have to put into action. And that's why we're actually having this conversation today.
Okay. Can you be a good seller if you don't know how to do this, or if you're not doing this?
I think a lot of people have been brought up with some erroneous beliefs on what's required to be an effective sales professional. And a big part of what those erroneous beliefs are rooted in is the idea that you need to be a product expert to be an effective sales professional. And in my experience, and I've built elite teams, I've been at the upper tiers as an individual contributor, in my experience, and this is also based off of experiences of people that like blow me out of the water as a seller, your best sellers in the marketplace are the ones that are the most effective at listening. They will have product expertise, but where you become really effective as a seller and you become elite is by deeply understanding the customer problem or problems that they face and listening actively to uncover if the problem that the person that you're sitting across from is the main one that you solve for. What happens is that a lot of sellers, in terms of how they've been developed, how they've been trained, is that they'll hear one thing that's a trigger event that points to your solution and it's off to the races. And that's why when you look at enterprise win rates for sales, it typically is around the 20 to 30%. So you're churning through your entire customer universe with 70% of your marketplace not even wanting to deal with you because you're showing up in a way that's inauthentic and creates friction between you and the buyer. And you're not listening. You're only listening for what you want to hear versus listening to what's important. And that's what the customer is telling you.
Okay. So maybe it's too vague a question, but how do you do that in this setting?
So
I'm a seller, let's say.
Yeah.
I want to sell our services. How do I listen better? And I know there have been books written on this or libraries written on this, on how to be a better listener as a seller. But since I'm not a sales guy, I'm counting on you to summarize the libraries full of literature on active listening for us today.
It's really simple. 5 things that should be critical in your toolkit to become a better active listener. Who, what, when, where, why. These are the basic principles of a reporter out of journalism. So if your customer says something, so, hey, I'm dealing with this problem. Oh, that's interesting, Danny or Dan. I'm in the habit of calling you Danny. That's how I know you originally from TikTok. So, that's really interesting that you mentioned that point. Tell me a little bit more about that. How does that impact you? What does that cause in terms of your day to day? So that is really all there is to it, rather than immediately. And Leslie Vanetz makes a great call to action on this regularly. Salespeople are naturally wired to want to help. So in those moments that matter, where you're talking to a customer and they're saying what they're saying, you need to fight your instinct to want to jump in and problem solve, and instead sit back and ask the who, what, when, where, why question about what they just mentioned, and then start digging into the problem. That's it.
That feels so familiar. Even when you put your consultant hat on, because a lot of B2B sales is consulting. And
they say it's consultative.
Yeah, they say that. And it's true, like you very often feel like a consultant when you're doing selling. And there's such a big temptation to like want to prescribe problems. And that is the opposite of what you want to be doing in a sales conversation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. You want to hesitate on prescribing too quickly. Prescription before diagnosis is malpractice. So you really want to adopt that when you're in the moment and resist the urge. Jen Allen of Lavender often calls it getting happy ears. Resist the urge to get happy ears when you hear just one sliver of a thing that might be relevant to the product that you're having, and just keep asking the necessary questions so that you're actually getting depth in terms of what the actual problem is.
Totally. Okay. And my next big question is, how do you teach people to listen actively? You gave us the general questions or the general framework that you have to be focusing on, but as anybody who has done any selling or marketing for that matter knows that what the customer tells you is never what the customer should be telling you. It's not verbalized that way. A lot of times you have to be addressing the unconscious that the customer or the buyer isn't even able to admit to themselves, or if they can, they might not be able to verbalize it in the way that it represents reality accurately. How do you learn how to do that?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's not something that you can immediately bullet point out into 3 or 4 different things. I think one of the key steps in putting you on the right path to answering that question that's specific to the problem that your customer is facing is that you're going to have to niche down on the type of customer that you are engaging with. And that points to a broader mistake that happens in the world of sales, where we look at our prospect universe as an entire universe. And really, what needs to be done is you need to look internally within your organization and identify, when you look at your most productive customers, what are the demographics? What's the criteria that make them your best customer? What industry are they in? What persona are you selling to? What problems existed before they engaged in that buy cycle to go to market? What was the situation before they started? And marketing should actually have a lot of intel in those areas. And if they don't, you as a seller have access to that information. So call your customer up and ask them, hey, I'm curious to understand the landscape before you went to market. Can we have a conversation where I can kind of peel back these layers? Use that customer interview process to make some assumptions into the marketplace that you're selling into. So here's what that means. So if your best customers are typically in manufacturing or whatever, then you want a territory plan in a way where you're focusing in on that industry and targeting the personas that you knew were most commonly involved in the buying process or initiated the buying process. Then you want to lead with some assumptions. So your question, how can you actually get deeper in terms of what the customer is saying and really get into the core problem? And this is where that customer research phase comes in, because when a customer says, I'm dealing with XYZ, you can say, I've talked to a ton of people who are CFOs in manufacturing companies, and they've described a similar problem. And often when they describe it, they mean this, and it shows up in this way within their organization. Is that what's happening to you? And then just be quiet and listen to what they say. It'll either be, no, that's not what's happening, this is what's happening, or that is what's happening. Then you can pull out another question is, okay, what are you doing now that it's happening? What have you tried to solve when these things showed up, or how have you tried to solve it? So that gives you sort of a framework or a template to work with when you can really dig in. But the net of all of that is you need to rely on marketing to find out what are the profiles of the companies that your best customers, what's the persona, what's the landscape or the journey that they were in before they actually went to market. And if you don't have that, drive it yourself and reach out to those personas, do an interview so you at least have a framework, and then you have a working theory to approach your niche as a seller. Does that help?
That is awesome. Okay, everybody. So you just got very accurate step-by-step instructions on how to dig way beneath the surface. Okay, so Jim started out by giving us the 5 simple questions: the who, what, where, and why, and when. And very often that'll get you part of the way. But what he just summarized was how to go beneath the surface and uncover stuff that is in the subconscious regions of your prospects or your buyer's mind. So now that we're talking about the conscious and the subconscious part, we're bringing AI into the picture. How is that for a pivot, Jim?
Hey, I'm flexible, so I'm good.
Okay, so we're talking salespeople, sales skills, active listening, and along comes this insignificant little thing called ChatGPT, which just happens to turn the world and the universe on its head. Or if it hasn't yet, it will in 10 months, 18 months, very soon. So how do you, as a professional seller, integrate this capability, this newfound, is it a threat? Is it an opportunity? So this newfound thing, how do you integrate this into your thinking, into your processes?
So I'm going to write that question down, but I think it's going to be valuable to set some context first into what the current situation of marketing and sales looks like. And specifically, I'm going to talk about sales because that's really where my domain is, because it's going to give context on why we need to do certain things going forward. So here's the selling landscape currently. And I'm talking to every seller that's out there currently, every sales leader. Tell me if any of these things sound familiar to you. Our customers aren't responsive to any of the messaging that we send out. Our customers are getting stalled at various stages of the buying process. They demonstrate urgency when they meet with us, but then they disappear. None of our outreach is really effective. Emails have cratered, calls have cratered. All of these things are just not working anymore. So as a sales leader and as a selling organization, you're faced with a question. How do we get our customers to pay attention to us? How do we rise above the sea of sameness that exists within B2B tech? The reason why you as a seller are experiencing these things is because buyers are tired of the same 1980s playbook that we are trotting out there as sellers to spray and pray to try to get in front of them. And it's rooted in a false belief. It's rooted in the belief that we are the gatekeepers to all of the knowledge that the buyer needs to make an informed decision. That's not true. There's recent research that came out by, I think, Gartner. Your buyers are moving through their buyer journey 70 to 80% of the way without you as a seller being tapped for anything. So what does that mean? That means that they're doing their research because we've made the experience, the buying experience, completely miserable for our buyers. They're doing it without you and trying to get as much possible as they can ahead of going to market. And here's where it's interesting. When it comes to who ends up winning, it's usually the people that are on the day one list that buyer has formulated after all of their research who ends up winning most of the time. So what does that mean for you as a seller? That means you can't go to market in a way where you're trying to capture the 3% of the marketplace that's currently in a buy cycle. You need to go to market in a way that's connecting with your entire prospect universe. And that is what you're facing now. And that has some serious implications when we look at how do we deal with AI that comes in. So I want to break a little bit and see if Dan, you have anything to say to that. But I think it's valuable to talk about the landscape as it is before we start talking about how is AI going to impact that landscape.
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on that?
That's a perfect way to go about it. Couldn't agree more. In that the way we usually put this when we try to explain to clients how their go-to-market strategy should look like, everybody hires GTM agencies to drive results and get the revenue numbers up. And what they're expecting is that we are going to help them fight and capture the 3% and go for the 3% who are in market. They're not aware of the fact that it's only 3%. They're assuming something like 30. Or another erroneous assumption is that even though they're not in market, we can make them want to buy right now. Our 300,000 euro or dollar solution. We can just make them want to buy it. They'll just want it so badly because our marketing and our sales is so clever. They'll just make budget for it. So that's the expectation. And then we show them that statistic, which is from Gartner, I think, about people going through the buying journey 70% of the way without ever talking to anybody and being like super predetermined on the 3 solutions that they have narrowed everything down to when they show intent and talk to a salesperson. But even when they show intent and they start searching for stuff and looking at stuff that the intent data providers can pick up and feed to companies, even by that time, somebody will have already created the demand for that given solution. And if they've done that, they will have framed the buyer's thinking and mind and infuse them with their own point of view on how they should go about solving their problem. So if you step in at that point, you're way behind.
Yeah.
The race is already started and you're still at the finish line and everybody's way ahead of you. So you're going to have to sprint twice as fast, which usually doesn't work because the other sprinters are fast, just like you. So you usually don't catch up and you're trying to battle and go into the bloodbath and the red ocean where everybody's fighting for the existing and already created demand and trying to capture that instead of going in way earlier, way softer, with a lot more value And that's what I think about your question.
Yeah, and you're hinting at one of the other common problems that sellers face. In that scenario that you and I both described, we've gotten into a deal late, and we're rushing to get to a proposal because the buyer has probably said, hey, we're talking to a few other companies already, and whatever reason that they gave to talk to you, it's whatever reason that is. So we're automatically thinking, oh, we have an active buyer on the hook, and the reality of it is you're not even in the game. So this is where some sales leaders get annoyed with what I have to say about that particular circumstance. Your number one responsibility as a seller is to identify what is the critical pain that the buyer is trying to solve, and does your product actually solve the most important pain in their situation right now, or are there better alternatives? And you're better served trying to kind of redirect that customer to the solution that best solves their current pain, versus trying to use yours and shoehorn your way into something that deals with a secondary level pain. How does all of this tie into the AI conversation that we're going to have? So organizations are faced with two different paths. So we already talked about the current situation that selling organizations are dealing with and buyer behavior. So when we're talking about AI, there's one of two things that you can do. You can look at what's happening, the trends that you've seen where none of your outreach is working and all of that stuff that we talked about. And you can sit there as a sales leader and say, well, I just need to do more because sales is a numbers game. So how can I actually, 10x my outreach doing the same thing that I was doing before? Well, AI can do that. I mean, if you already have like crappy outreach that isn't responding well, you can just throw AI behind it and they can churn that out. It'll probably crush your domain reputation, but the details, whatever. And you know what? You can probably catch some wins doing that approach in the short run. You can run it 24/7, blasting out emails, blasting out, you can get auto dialers and put that in and allow offshore teams to kind of try to connect with more people and try to get people, like force them into that down funnel stage. That's an option.
The other thing you've got to discuss here is your approach to problem solving, because there's a trap that sales leaders walk into here. What's the situation? The situation is that sales is not working. Obvious assumption is that, okay, if sales is not working, let's fix sales. Let's do sales better. Let's increase the efficiency. One way to go about it is what you said, turn up the numbers. It's a numbers game. So yeah, 5x everything that goes out, and we'll probably get 5x results. If we're able to, 5x the input here, then the output should be somewhere around 5x. Of course, it never is because of diminishing returns. And the other assumption is that the reason it's not working is because we're not saying the right things. Our messaging isn't clever enough. So very often we're brought into companies and the sales team is like, help us fix our outbound emails. And the outbound emails can be fixed up because they very often suck. But we tell them, guys, like, this will not solve the general problem that you lack demand. You don't have a clear point of view in the marketplace. You're a commodity solution. Nobody wants to talk to you in the first place. So a more clever message might get you like 9% more meetings. It's just going to drop off later, and it's not going to solve your solution. It's not going to solve the problem.
You're absolutely right. And the more clever messaging, it will have some results. But the first thing that sellers need to understand is you can't treat every buyer in your prospect universe as if they're part of that 3%. Josh Braun often talks about the object of any outreach is to create a conversation. And that becomes a central question that sellers need to examine in terms of how they do their outreach. How are you approaching your entire buyer landscape with something of value? And value, your product isn't what's valuable. It's your ability to tap in at any stage of that buyer journey and bring that person into your ecosystem and have meaningful conversations about what they're going through. And then through those conversations, prioritizing where they are or where your attention should be based on where they are on their buyer journey. Oftentimes what happens as sellers is that we make it all about us. It's our sales process. It's our sales stage. It's our
Yeah.
product market fit that we care about. And we're just, looking inward instead of really focusing on the customer, where they're at, and trying to have meaningful conversations across the entire customer landscape versus treating every customer as if they're part of that 3% that is in the buy cycle right now.
Sales and marketing have a disagreement there. Everybody agrees on the fact that you need to be starting conversations. And back in the 80s, as you were referring to, like what happened before marketing got good at communicating at scale in B2B markets, what happened then was that sales was used as a demand generation method. So you would rely on your sales team to call up prospects and tell them, hey, did you know that there are these problems in the marketplace? They would generate demand one-on-one. And a lot of companies still do that and still use outbound for that. And there are two problems with that. One, that it's super expensive. Two, that nobody wants to be talking to salespeople to get that kind of information, because nobody needs that kind of information from a human being. It's just a channel. So using the one-on-one sales channel for that, just an outdated thing that is working less and less.
Yeah. And, it again relies using outbound in that way. It's built on an erroneous belief is that we have all of the information that sellers need to make an informed decision. So if you're going to market that way, that's gonna be a problem. So I have zero disagreement with you. I want to go back to the question that you were asking. When we look at the emergence of AI, how can sellers and marketers integrate that into their go forward approach? And integration is an important word, both from an AI perspective, but also from a sales and marketing perspective as well. So when you're looking at the landscape as it is in terms of the challenges that sellers are facing in terms of getting the attention of the buyers, AI can help those buyers or help those sellers who integrate it into their process by shifting off low-level tasks, because those things that are admin related, those are low-value events that keep you away from interfacing with a customer in a human-to-human way. Those are things that AI can help you with. So think in terms of documentation and automation along those lines. If you're on Zoom calls every day and you're not using a tool like Fathom to record those calls and build summaries and throw that into your CRM, you're wasting a lot of time on admin work that pulls you away from customer facing activities. So that's one way that you can do it. What I fear is that a lot of sales organizations are going to take a different approach, which is, hey, let's just focus on volume. We'll eliminate our SDR ranks. We'll use AI to kind of automate all of our outbound and try to capture the market that way. And here's where I think I'm not too far off from saying that's going to be the model. Think about what exists in the marketplace right now. So Chili Piper, great product, and it actually prioritizes inbound requests based on how qualified that inbound request is and routes it to the appropriate seller. So if it's a highly qualified inbound intent lead, that will go to your best seller. If it's mid qualified, goes to somebody else. If it's not really qualified, it goes into our nurture bucket. There's a new product out called Testbox, which allows companies to load up demo environments into their platform, and it allows customers to self-serve their way into your product. So Testbox is growing like crazy. And if you pair that with buyer behavior, imagine an integration with Chili Piper, Testbox, and a customer landscape where they're doing all of their research. Customers are going to self-select those products that create a frictionless buying experience. And then what happens to that bloated team of SDRs and AEs that's doing outbound? Your customers are already moving in that direction. So it becomes critical that you don't make the mistake approaching the market like a robot and thinking that you can volume your way to success. You need to pivot and sell into the marketplace as a human does, doing the things that only humans can do. And that's building relationships and conversations at scale that are meaningful. So that is the route that I'm seeing your best sellers are going to need to take. And that's how you integrate ABM, like you opened the conversation with. This is how you integrate ABM into the mix.
Do you know the company Winning by Design?
I've heard of them. I'm not like super familiar with them.
So their leader is a smart guy. He's a Dutch man, Jocko, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his last name because I'd get it wrong. But he put out a white paper, and in that white paper at the end of last year, he claimed part of the reason why SaaS is struggling is because they ruined the game for themselves. Meaning, you had all of these tools are able to be operated by a trained monkey, basically, and give a trained monkey level somebody the power to go out at scale, amplify messages in like with very little thought given to the consequences. And when this happens simultaneously to like 80% of the market, and everybody starts using these tools, and there are more tools and better tools and better data, so more accurate data, then what you have is sort of a disaster that kills all the previous ways of selling that worked, that used to work. Part of what's happening now is, the market eating their own dog food. I don't know if I agree with that 100%. So there are other like macroeconomic things at play here that, let's just call it a sobering out of the marketplace in SaaS and technology. But as far as selling and marketing go, it's totally true. So that you have these insanely powerful tools, Lavender and whatnot, and you can do a lot of damage if you use them in a stupid way. And it's what's happening.
Yeah. And, I think it goes back to how are we equipping our people with fundamental principles on how to have effective conversations and build connection instead of just here's the template, let's just blast it out and see what we can get. And that's sort of the difference. We have to go back to those basics. Here's how it ties into how you can attack or not attack, how you can approach your entire marketplace with something meaningful. We always talk about the disconnect between sellers and the marketplace. Sellers think when we're thinking about a hero story, sellers think that we're the hero in the buyer's story. And I often say, we're not the hero in the buyer's story. The buyer is the hero in the buyer's story. If we're not going to market in a way that connects the buyer to their initiatives, their goals, their vision for success, you're not going to get in front of those people in a meaningful way. In a practical way, here's how you do it. Going back to that example that I mentioned earlier, which is not just knowing the 5, who, what, when, where, why, and how. Yeah. Not just knowing that, but drilling in to a level that's informed by your expertise of the niche that you're selling into. That actually allows you a way to integrate what marketing does and what sales does in a unified go-to-market that gets you in front of everybody. This is the way that you do it, is by leveraging the expertise of your potential buyer and asking them how they're solving for a problem that you've seen other personas struggle with, and spotlighting their expertise to bring in conversations and meaningful conversations that allow you to kind of discern where are they in terms of this particular problem in the buyer journey, and it allows you to prioritize those conversations based on where they're at. That's the pivot that needs to be made. If you want to be building meaningful connections across your entire landscape, think about the common problems that your buyer is dealing with. And then instead of asking them, hey, are you dealing with this problem? Ask them, I have a lot of people in my network that are dealing with this problem. I've seen that you are doing some really interesting things at XYZ company. How have you solved for this? And then you're actually putting into practice how you make the buyer the hero in the story versus making it all about you.
Amen. That was awesome. Okay.
Thank you for attending my TED Talk.
Mic drop. That's it. I want to end on an upbeat note here with a.
That was pretty upbeat.
It was.
Did you just call me a Debbie Downer?
That was awesome. Okay, so what is the future holding for us, and who's going to rock it in sales? So what type of qualities do salespeople need to excel?
So I don't think anything I'm going to say is going to be earth-shattering. It's going to be how you apply it. Your best sellers are super curious, and they're continuous learners. And what it means, if you're asking the question, what is the secret to success when it comes to the seller of the future? It's those sellers who are integrating marketing principles and customer and buyer centric selling and marketing principles and how they go to market. And it goes back to what I said, make the buyer the hero in their story. And you have to look at marketing as an ally. And here's a great use case. There is a common area of friction within organizations of any reasonable size that sellers are going to say marketing doesn't know what the hell they're talking about, and marketing is going to say we drove a bunch of leads and sellers can't close. That's a fundamentally misaligned perspective, because marketing is the voice of the customer, and if you as sellers aren't taking the voice of what the customer is saying and using that to inform how you go to market, you're making a fatal error in terms of how you're leveraging all of that great stuff that marketing is doing. So if marketing puts out a white paper, your messaging shouldn't be, as a seller, hey, Dan, I saw that we recently put out a white paper. Would you like to see it? Dan says yes, fills out his information. As soon as he fills it out, you're calling him back and saying, hey, Dan, I saw that you downloaded our white paper. You ready for a demo? That is what happens now. And your best sellers are going to shift that dynamic and instead look at that white paper use case. And then the follow-up is going to be, why were you interested in the white paper in the first place? Why was this relevant? How are you going to apply it? Was it a good white paper? What did you learn out of it? And that should be how sellers are engaging with that prospect that does anything that's a trigger event in your ecosystem. Just because they look at a white paper doesn't mean they're ready to buy. And integrating and leveraging what marketing is doing and understanding what marketing is doing from a buyer journey perspective and having the appropriate conversation at the appropriate time is one of the big keys that sellers need to tune into to create that conversation and relationship at scale and reduce the friction in the buying process.
Yeah. And is it easy to start conversations with those people? So can you give us a few ways? You've mentioned one that, okay, somebody's downloaded a white paper. You don't want to start nurturing them with some crappy generic sequence. You want to start a conversation. I totally agree with that. What are some good ways to do this? Some genuinely constructive ways of starting a conversation with these. We don't want to call them leads. We want to call them contacts. So they're in your database. They're contacts. They're not leads.
You mentioned my approach, and this is how I apply ABM as a seller. Before I even knew what ABM was, this was like a core part of what I do. I'm not calling like 1,000 different companies. I'm identifying maybe 20 or 50 over, let's say, a 2-month period that look viable based on the information. And then I'm having sort of one-to-one conversations across it. So in those trigger events, maybe they attended a webinar, maybe they downloaded a white paper, maybe they did something that marketing caught wind of or drove, and then now it's on your radar. You need to keep it as basic as possible and engage your curiosity. And the basics of engaging your curiosity is, what did you think of the webinar? Like, how is this relevant? What did you think of the speakers? What could we have done differently? Is this something that you're facing right now? Is this something that's on your radar? So that's how you engage your curiosity. And I think the flaw, it's really basic. I'm a little hesitant to even mention it. Whenever something happens, your number one reflex should be to be curious versus making a value judgment on why that thing is happening. And oftentimes what happens is that people are making value judgments. Oh, they downloaded a white paper, they attended a webinar. That must mean that they're dealing with this situation right now. So let me engage with them so I can sell them something.
That's a key skill right there that you've mentioned for the second time. Because one of my previous questions was, what traits does the rock star salesperson of the future need to possess? And probably one of the most important merits or traits in business ever, or in any professional field, is probably curiosity.
Absolutely.
And curiosity coupled with the ability to ask non-judgmental questions. So curiosity about the real truth, even if it's uncomfortable at first, to ask those non-judgmental questions.
And, if every seller in the world says that their aspiration is to be a trusted advisor, that's how you execute that. Yeah. Trusted advisors ask the uncomfortable questions and then refer based on those answers to the appropriate solution. And that can often mean that solution isn't yours. It's when we ignore that we become just a vendor and we become commoditized in the process. And that commoditization is what leads to, or will lead, if it doesn't change, to the entire sales function or big chunks of the sales function to get AI'd out. If you approach the marketplace as a transaction, well, guess what? People can do binary decision trees pretty easily, and you can do them 24/7. And that's where the risk is. Got to get away from being a transactional seller in the marketplace.
Any use cases that you would want to caution people against when using new tools or any setups? Or so what should we be avoiding? The temptation is so big to test these new things and to quickly make a big jump in our numbers.
I mean, my immediate reaction to that question is, when presented with the option, increasing the volume of activity, you should think deeply about whether that's actually going to achieve the results that you're looking for. So whether you're talking about emails, calls, whatever, does simply amplifying or increasing the volume of that going to get me where I need to get to if what I'm already doing from a volume perspective isn't working? That is really the one thing that I would caution everybody against doing.
Yeah, resist the temptation to get easy volume.
Yeah,
that's how I would dumb it down.
Sell like a human. Have conversations. Be curious. I mean, don't take the easy way, because like you said, Dan, there is no shortage of tools in the selling landscape. The things that will optimize and amplify any number of things that you're doing, there's no shortage of those things. But the key is, relationships and business is done on a one-to-one basis, on a relationship to relationship basis. And if you're not focusing on that first, you're going to struggle on all the downstream stuff. So focus on relationships, focus on conversations, focus on creating the space that allows you to shift the thinking that your buyer is on right now. But if you're just approaching it as a transaction, you're never going to get there.
Awesome. Jim, is there anything I should have asked you but didn't?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. I mean, I could talk about this stuff for forever. And we haven't even really gotten into like the deep mechanics of how you execute ABM as a seller. I mean, the short version of it is that instead of
do another show on that. We've got to do another show on that.
The short version, the TLDR version of that is, don't look at your territory and every company as a viable prospect. You got to set the stage correctly to make sure that you're working in the proper hitting zone that maximizes your chance for success. And that's often, just like anything else, niching down to that segment that's most likely to hear your message. And that's going to require some front end work for you to be effectively driving things down funnel.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was the teaser for the next conversation with Dr. Jim Kanichirayil. Thank you so much for being on, Jim. I will get back to you and drag you back on this show because I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun hanging out. If anybody that's watching this has any questions or whatever, just feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. But it was a lot of fun. I can talk about this stuff all the time.
Yeah, so hit Jim up on LinkedIn. We'll have his link to his profile in the show notes. And have a great day or afternoon wherever you are. Thanks for listening. Bye, everybody.